It's a Fourth Ash history on tap, and it's our first one outdoors. And I think it's really nice to be able to sit on the deck here by Rainy Lake and have a libation, or a soda, or a sarsaparilla, and enjoy a fine evening of entertainment. We're fortunate tonight to have Martha Greene Phillips, whose dad came through the area between 1906 and 1916, an area or a time period that we know very little about because it's just before our settlement and right after the fur trade. And he kept notes on his travels, and his daughter Martha edited the journals and published them. And he also was a super photographer. We all ooh and ah at Ober's photographs, but Howard Greene's photographs are the equivalent to Ober's. They're just wonderful. I think during his trip he took 800 and how many photographs?
800 plus.
800 plus, and there's 300 some photographs in this book. And there are some of the photographs that we reproduced that we thought would be indicative of some that are in his photographs, like the Kettle Falls Hotel, which everyone recognizes, and Renier, which everyone recognizes. And one thing that intrigued me,
It's been a while since I've been bartending, so.
One thing that intrigued me was when he got here, he had no good maps to navigate by. He used the 1894 gold mine map that Winchell put together for his geological survey, his 6-volume opus on the geology of Minnesota. And one thing he keeps relating to is he keeps talking to people and how he can find his way to various places. And I thought it was going to be fantastic. But I won't keep you. I'll turn it over to Martha and let her tell you about it.
Hi. I think the first thing I'll tell you is I sometimes wander away from the microphone, so wave or something if I pull back too far. I'm not a karaoke person, so I don't do well with that. I'm glad to be here on Rainy Lake and in Renier. My dad was here 3 times during these trips. Some of it is still the same, which is really fun. I had thought this might be the old hotel where he stayed. This was not. There's another, but similar building.
Yeah.
And that's all in these journals. I want to acknowledge before I begin the University of Minnesota Press, which did an incredibly beautiful job of putting this book together at an affordable price. Minnesota History gave a grant. The Wisconsin Historical Society took care of reproducing all the photographs for the book because my dad's negatives, some of which were glass plate and some were on film negatives, they were all the large format 4x5 images, were burned up in a house fire. And so to get quality images, Wisconsin Historical Society took photographs of all the original photographs and reproduced them at high resolution for the book. They did a little tinting in here just to even them out because some of the coloring was different, but they're amazing photographs, as you can see that they can be enlarged this way without any real loss of resolution. And I'm thankful for regional and local historians and people who just like history and people who help me out along the way. Several people from this area were helpful to me, including Bob Hilke and Mary Graves, and Ed has helped me out with some of the identification, and I'm counting on some of you to help me know more about the area. I'm sure you're going to look at pictures and say, that's right, or that's not right, or this is Joe Schmo's store, or whatever. And that's all helpful, so I hope you'll do that. Several years before I wrote the book, I traveled here to explore the region's history, and I talked with people here, and I mentioned Bob, Mary Graves, Ed helped out quite a bit too. Local historians are so important, and I think you have a lively historical society here, and I hope you'll always support it, because you know much more than we can find out online or at a larger museum. I want to tell you about my father a little bit, about some of his journals, the remarkable journals, and then about the trips he took. To start with, if you've wondered at all about how my father was here in 1906, traveling as an adult, I will tell you. My dad was born in 1864 in the Civil War. He was named after his uncle who was killed in Tennessee. My dad went off, lived in Milwaukee. His dad had a wholesale drug business. He went to college, took over that business, got married, had a family, did all the normal things. And then wanted to take his sons camping, which I'll come back to in a moment. But years after these journals were done, and when he was in his late 60s, he met my mom and had a second family, as a widower, had a second family after the age of 70. So he was 79 when I was born. And he lived to 93, quite healthy, quite active, quite alert, broke his hip and died from pneumonia, which happened often back then. But so I knew him until I was 13 and grew up with these images and the journals in my home. Grew up with one foot in one era and one foot in the other, as far as, my dad could quote Longfellow and would, just read from memory. He would quote Long Stand This by Longfellow and Hiawatha or Paul Bunyan, things that, are of a much different generation than my generation or my mother's generation. So I grew up with a lot of the lore of the North Woods and wilderness from him, from his experiences, but also because it was such a popular thing at that time. Everyone knew Longfellow. Everyone could quote the stanzas. My dad was a businessman, as I said, and grew up working in the business. After his father died, he took over the business, spent about 15 years getting it back on even keel, buying out a partnership, getting that settled, surviving the financial panic of 1893, which was kind of like the Depression. It was not quite as widespread, but it was a very deep depression. He served in the Spanish-American War. By 1906, he was really tired of working so hard. He had the business on even keel. He could leave it for a little while. He wanted his sons to get out of the city, to explore, to be more independent, and to learn how to be more self-reliant. He wanted that experience for them. A lot of people in his age, especially gentlemen of means, were going out into the wilderness, but most of them were going out to lodges where they were escorted and taken out on fishing trips, or maybe taken on a guided hunting trip. And I'm sure he heard a lot of that in the clubs in Milwaukee, but he wanted to get out and really experience it. He loved being in the Army and being out in the wilderness then. And as I said, he wanted his kids to not be too citified and too urban. Also at that time, just for general historical trends, I think it's important to realize that that era was one in which the wilderness was very much romanticized in paintings and music, poetry. Dvorak came over and wrote the New World Symphony during the 1890s. And if you listen to that, I'm sure you're familiar with it in some way. It's just this very expansive piece. It's like this was the wilderness, this was this wonderful open space. Teddy Roosevelt was going out and testing himself in it. So it was kind of a sign of the times. I think the only difference between my dad and his peers was that he was really interested in just doing it on his own. He had surveying experience from the Spanish-American War. He could figure out maps. He could orient himself well. And that allowed him to work from basic USGS maps and organize his trips around that. Ed mentioned, and I'll just reiterate, that this was a time, long before Aldo Leopold, long before Calvin Rutstrom was canoeing here, and all the people that we know as the famous recreational kind of canoeists post-World War I. He was 20 years over senior. He was 30 years Rutstrom's and the other, excuse me. And so he was canoeing when they were kids. And he does fit an important slot in the history of the area. My dad, every day when they went out to go out on his trips, would take handwritten notes. And there's a picture of him over there writing notes in camp. And he took hundreds of pictures. This is over 8 journals. There were over 800 pictures of these large format pictures. He would go back to Milwaukee and he would type up his notes. He typed them up in triplicate and gave a copy to each of the campers that went along. Those were his his peers, his friends, and I'll tell you more about them, and the boys that went along. So every one of them got a leather-bound large journal with all the photos mounted in it. Bob has seen one. Bob came across one. Now at the island, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, okay. So everyone got one, and over the 100 years, most of those have disappeared. I think I have the only complete set. One of the youngsters that went camping had all of his, and I tracked him down to Chicago, and they're in one of the libraries there. So it was fun to find out that they knew that their grandfather, who was a young boy on these trips, loved the trips. And when I contacted them, expecting them to say, now explain this again, how your father could have been in there, and the whole time lapse issue. They said, oh, our grandfather talked about those trips all the time. So there are a few more in the Newberry Library in Chicago. But they are, because he liked to take notes and record history, that's why they are a treasure now. I'm going to walk you through some of the trips and how this all developed. To start with, the first trip that they took was on the Wisconsin River. And this was a trip my father was going to take with one of his good friends and his son and two of his sons and one of the son's friends. His older son ended up in the hospital and couldn't go. But they expected him to be okay and to be able to travel, so they went ahead on the trip expecting that he could take a train to some nearby siding and that they could pick him up along the way. That did not work out. He was not able to come. So my dad was writing letters every day to his son in the hospital telling him what they were doing because they didn't want them to miss out. At that time, while traveling along the Wisconsin River through the logging area, he could slip a letter to someone at a siding that would be picked up by a logging train or something and then end up in Milwaukee within a day and back. So there's this very active letter writing going back and forth. And about 3/4 of the way through the trip, he realized he had the makings of a journal, that if he just kept all those letters, it would be a story of the trip. At the end of the trip, he was thrilled with the trip. The son that went along was. Everyone wanted to do it again, get out to a more wild place. And so the tradition of doing a trip every summer, or almost every summer, was born, and the tradition of starting a journal. So from there on out, he was intent on writing the journals and keeping notes. The second trip they made was on the St. Croix River in Wisconsin in 1907. And they sought out the St. Croix because it was a little wilder. They wanted something a little, less tame than the Wisconsin, which had stores and settlers and a lot of people around. The St. Croix, I think they chose, I don't know from his journal why they made that decision, but at the time the St. Croix and the Brule River in Wisconsin formed a major trading route for the Native Americans and for the fur trade. And during the 1880s, the Army Corps of Engineers was actually thinking about making a canal from the Brule down through the St. Croix to the Mississippi, so it would be a Lake Superior to Mississippi route. Seems kind of foolish now. It was an impossible plan, but I'm sure my dad was reading about that in the papers. And at that point, he was a 20, 30-year-old man reading about the Army Corps of Engineers plan, so that would have made the St. Croix an attractive river. So they went out on the St. Croix, they had good times, they saw Native Americans, the boys saw Native Americans for the first time. There's a wonderful picture of the youngest son just staring at this young Native American woman with a baby, all in beadwork and things, and just astounded. They just hadn't had that kind of exposure. And the only exposure they had at that point was through the Buffalo Bills show. That was how you knew about Native Americans. So the St. Croix was a good trip. It had more of the ingredients that they wanted, more wildness, more interest, a little rougher water and sometimes. But at the end of that, they wanted more. They wanted more wilderness. The next trip that they made was on the Presque Isle River in Upper Michigan, which is now in the Porcupine Mountains State Park, if you know that area at all. But it's basically a vertical river down to Lake Superior. They could not know that because there were no guidebooks and no information, but someone had said it was a good river to go on. So my dad wrote to two lumbering friends and said, what do you think about going on the Presque Isle. And one said, no, you won't like it at all. And the other said, oh no, try it. It'll be a wonderful trip. And the first few days were on kind of level terrain, and they had a wonderful trip. And then they got into some very dangerous situations. There had been, I think, 13 inches of rain in Ashland a couple of weeks before that, so it was just a torrent going down this elevation. Most of their portages were within the river. There was old-growth forest on both sides, no trails, no nothing. So they were down in the river taking these canvas and wooden canoes through and repairing and patching and fixing as they did, carrying all their heavy freight along. They almost didn't make it, but they did. And it was the hardest trip they ever made. It was always the benchmark for how hard a trip could be, but they didn't want to do anything quite that rugged again. So the next year, they decided to go on not on Rainy Lake, but from Ely, Winton area to Renier. And this was the beginning of the trips that I think people here will really enjoy. When they went on these trips, they went by many forms of transportation, but they first took the train to Ely, a buggy to Winton, and then on the canoes on through what's now the BWC in Quetico. The 1910 journal is everyone's favorite. It has the most beautiful pictures of dams of Native Americans in their villages. It's just the best adventure of all the trips. I think anyone who goes through the books, that's it. That's the best one of them all. The gang of people that went on these trips got fully developed in that, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. My dad had 3 good friends who were outdoorsmen, consummate outdoorsmen. One was a gynecologist in Milwaukee who was a bachelor, also a Renaissance man. He was an art collector, a musician. He did a little bit of everything, but he really knew the outdoors. So and that was Doc. He shows up in all the journals and is teaching the kids and working with them and making a real leadership role. The other 2 men were Milwaukee businessmen that he knew and liked to be in the outdoors, and they came along. They were a little less significant. Of the boys that went along, it was my half-brothers, my dad's son from his first family, and they brought friends from their school that they went to along. So it was a somewhat revolving group of kids, but some were the regulars. One big Clay, the young man that grew up in Chicago, and whose journals are still there. They all came to call my dad, and it was Dad and the Gang. So Dad and the Gang really was formed during the 1910 trip. They enjoyed that trip. So in 1911, they came back, and on the trip they called the Dawson Trail, that being Dawson's survey route for the border between Canada and the U.S. And if anyone knows more, correct me, please feel free. They followed the route that was built to quell the Riel Rebellion. And so it was a different route through, but ending up at Renier again. One of the really important things about this Dawson trip was that they went through Canadian Customs. And because they went through Canadian Customs, they had to prepare a list of what they were taking along. And this was invaluable to me in terms of learning more about how they traveled. And I think it's something that people really enjoy. It's two pages of things that they brought along. They had to declare. They had 3 tents, Amazon tents, a large, a small, and one for storage, and ground cloths. Tents did not have sewn-in floors in 1910. They also did not have mosquito netting, and that's important in these stories. They brought 4 canoes, what they called Bill's old one-gun boat. They brought a folding boat, not in 1911, but the folding boat is in the picture with a sail. I did not know they made folding boats in 1910, so that was news to me. But anyway, so they brought all the paddles and all the canoes, pack straps, the things you'd ordinarily think of. They brought a quart of orange shellac. They brought white lead for repairing the canvas canoes. Leather treatment for treating all the leather straps. And it was just such a different time of outfitting than now. They brought a couple of guns. They did try to get game. They weren't real effective with that. They were better fishermen than hunters, I think. Bake ovens, oven pans. They were baking in camp all the time. There were no freeze-dried foods. I'm sure most of you know this, but just to remind, no freeze-dried foods. They were carrying 100 pounds of flour and baking bread in camp on their off days. So they were doing that with a reflector oven. Some of the foods they brought were quite interesting. One was a food called Erbswurst. Is anybody familiar with that? Okay. It took me a while to work on this one. They said they brought Erbswurst in here, and my dad refers in the journals about cooking up dynamite soup, and I had no idea what he was talking about. Slowly it all pieced together, and I've learned that Erbswurst was a ration carried during the Franco-Prussian War and used by men who went out into the woods. It was basically a dried pea soup put back into a sausage casing. And so they had these sticks of a dried pea soup, I was a porridgey kind of thing, and they would just throw those into a kettle of boiling water and have a very substantial supper, an easy one. But they look like sticks of dynamite, the dried herbs. So that took a while. I finally found that on some reenactors site. They finally explained that herbs were dynamite. Okay. I had a lot of fun doing the research on this. It was kind of like a detective story. Enjoyed working on that. A lot of the things I was familiar with. I did not know what Sepolio was, but it was an all-purpose soap. They carried 4 pounds of tea, 3 pounds of baking powder, 25 pounds of prunes. So, but they didn't get a lot of exercise, I guess, other than portage. They needed the prunes. They carried double tongue. They carried cans of salmon and 4 5-pound pails of lard. They were baking blueberry pies in there, too. So I'm sure they used lard for their bread and for their pies. Pettijohn's breakfast food, made in Minneapolis during the 1800s. Laundry soap, canned foods, canned peaches, just a huge amount of material. And my friend Mike tried to put together a list of all the foods and what they might have weighed. And I think he came up with, 1,500? 1,500 pounds they were carrying with their canvas canoes, and lightening along the way, but still a lot to carry. Their next trip was on what they called the Pigeon River, but they called it the Pigeon Trip. They went from Duluth by steamer up to Hoagland or Chicago Bay, which way you know it. Took a wagon and team up over the Sawtooth Mountains and to an idle logging camp. This was a year that not everyone could go, and it was a little lighter weight trip, so they just wanted to base camp it. And they went into Lake McFarland as guests of a lumber company. Lumber company's camp was idle for the summer, and they could kind of use that for their kitchen and set up their tents nearby. At the time they went in, I thought the sign said no horns, didn't it?
Except for when you're talking.
Yeah. At the time they went in, the lumber company was having a huge dispute with a man named Frank Kugler, who was an Austrian settler who had left Austria over religious persecution, wanted to just live away from people, run his trap line, have a life. But he owned both sides of the little channel between Pine Lake and McFarland Lake, and he wanted to charge the lumber company for running through there. And they were not happy about that. So there was this big dispute going. The lumber company was really down on him. But my dad and the gang went in there, they met Frank, they absolutely fell with this guy. He was an amazing man, and they spent the whole week getting to know Frank and learning what he was doing, which probably did not go well with the lumber company. The dispute had gotten so bad that at one point the lumber company went in and dynamited the channel to make it wider while he was away and ruined his basement storehouse of things because it flooded with water. It was pretty ugly, but that's the way things were then. It was just like, if you wanted to make a dam, you made a dam. If you wanted to blow up somebody else's channel, you just did it. It was just the way it was. But Frank Kugler was such a colorful character, and he went on to become a supervisor in that county in later years, and did take part in the community. He also was accused of murdering a man when was cleared of it. But if any of you read Calvin Rutstrom's books, he turns up in Calvin's books And I came across Frank again there. So kind of a fun story, more about Frank than about canoeing or boundary waters or whatever. The next trip that they went on was from Tower to Renier. And this is a smaller trip as far as a lot of the boys in the gang were no longer available. They were getting older, they were going off to college, they had other interests. But my dad got a few together, and Doc and my dad and some of the boys went out from Tower to Renier. This is it's a less significant trip, but it was still a good one, and the photographs and the narrative would probably be of interest again to you in this area, because you can track from 1910 to 1911 and then to 1915 the differences in what they were seeing. Kettle Falls is a good example. There are several pictures up there of Kettle, which Mike could talk about more than I probably, but the dam was being built, the old hotel was new, the old hotel that everyone runs to see was not built on their first trip yet. So it's a worthwhile trip as far as just filling in, but probably a less exciting trip to read about. There's less kids, less people involved. Their last trip was on the Chippewa River in 1916, and this was my dad and Doc and one of my dad's nephews. All the boys from the gang had sort of taken off in their own direction at that time, but they wanted to get one more trip in. Introduce this nephew to the outdoors in the same way that they had the older boys. And that was an enjoyable trip, but it was kind of a small trip. And World War I was in the wings. On that trip, as they read around the campfire, they were reading a book on socialist Germany. So you can kind of get the sense of the war is right there. In this book, 6 of my dad's journals are reprinted entirely. The narrative is entirely reprinted. The first one, the Wisconsin, and the last one on the Chippewa are edited and narrated and foreshortened, because they were a little different. They were sort of bookends on the big trips. But some of the photographs and some of the pictures are still significant historically, but the 6 journals in the middle really hold together. And the guys had a wonderful time traveling. There's a lot of camaraderie. I think one of the things I ended up feeling at the end of writing the book was how lucky I was that I got to go on these trips with my dad, because they didn't take girls. My one half sister did not get to go on these trips. These were boys' trips with the men. And after working on the book for 5 years, I kind of felt like I paddled most of the way with them, and I got another crack at knowing my dad again and having that fun. But they had such repartee, they enjoyed each other. The boys were always learning, and learning in a way that tested them rather than a real conscious didactic teaching kind of way. They had their rough experiences, they had some trial and error things, and all the men that went were experts in one area or another of natural history, so they were also learning birds and flowers and geology along the way. I think it was a remarkable experience for the young boys, and at the end I say I'm a little jealous that they got to go, but I did in an armchair travel kind of way. I will tell you another story and read a little bit, and then I want discussion and questions, please. In terms of the boys exploring, I think Carl is the character. He's the artist. He's the joker. He's the real character of my half brothers. And up in Lake McFarland on their Pigeon River trip, he'd gotten separated from the group. They were out on a hike or something, but they knew kind of that he was in the area. They weren't real worried about him, but he was still on his own to find his way back. And they were sitting in camp wondering when he might turn up and where he'd come in from. And they heard the splashing out on the water. And there was Carl. He had found an old log, a board that had some nails in it on the shore. He cobbled that together with a rock and was, laying down on it, paddling across the lake. And it was just like the most unlikely raft to make it, but he did it. I mean, he got there and he did it, and that's the kind of thing that they were allowed to do. I'm sure if he'd not come in till much later, they would have gone out and looked for him. they did an 11-mile hike to try to find the family dog when the dog got separated on one of the trips. So I'm sure they would have gone after Carl. But he had some chance to test himself. I want to read just a short piece written by my dad at the excuse me. In 1926, after the First World War, after lots of things had changed, my dad wanted to do another trip, and so did Doc and a few others. But they all couldn't get away. The boys were all married by then. So my dad borrowed another friend's son to take to Montana on a horsepacking trip. My dad was in his 60s, so I'll give him credit for taking off on a 3 horsepacking trip with some kids. But I want to read what he said about the camping trips from Montana, a retrospect. In other years, when others besides the Doc, Howard, Clay, Carl, and I constituted the gang, I wrote journals for the boys telling of our preliminary gatherings to discuss untraveled routes, of dinners at which it was understood no final decision was to be reached, and of other gatherings to which past and possible new members were invited. And there all matters previously and formally decided upon became res gestae, and the departure date was fixed. Then followed a week or 2 of overhauling canoes, tentage, bedrolls, and camp utensils, of buying groceries in camp stores and having these sent a week or more in advance to some almost unknown way station, where we came, looked our last upon civilization, and by latitude and departure worked out upon maps, we explorers set out for a point lying somewhere across the wilderness. Those days are now only fond recollections, for with the unwinding years, the boys had grown to man's estate. The war that took some to other camps, and after the war, the gang was but a memory and an occasional reunion dinner. And now, experience in fields, camps, and sundry places has taught me that the best form of recuperation for a tired mind and body is to break loose from the usual manner of life and to go away with men who live outdoors in the great open places, where the postman does not come, nor the ADT boy bear brief and importune messages. I admit that in the years since our last camps on Lake Superior, I had grown weary. I wanted to go to places not clearly marked between night rests, the distance and the day's travel by horse and pack train. Thank you for your attention. Questions, discussions, anything? Comments? Okay. I'll also be happy for you to page through my book, even if you don't want to buy one. It's well bookmarked, but if you want to look through a little bit. Yes?
Did your father keep journals other than on the trips?
No, he did keep a diary that he called a diary, but it was a very personal, it wasn't something that he ever wanted printed. As a matter of fact, he asked that those be destroyed at his death. I was surprised at that, and when I learned that, but these were public, but those were his personal notes, so no. He did a lot of letter writing, and I have quite a few, by no means not all of his from all those years, but I have quite a few of his letters which have been very interesting to me, and a letter he wrote to a friend in Milwaukee and what he was talking about and what was going on in his life. So I have some of those that kind of are a journal, but he didn't intend them as such. Yes?
In the Spanish-American War, did he get down to Cuba?
No, he only got to Alabama, where he took wonderful pictures of people. I gave a stack this big of his pictures from his Alabama experience in the Spanish-American War to the Veterans Museum in Madison. Again, large format, gorgeous pictures, but he did not get to Cuba. He was in the Corps of Engineers. Maybe they didn't need him. They didn't need his unit.
How many children were involved in his family?
All told, there are 7 of us. I'm the baby. I'm the last. I had 3 half-brothers and a half-sister in his first family. And I knew a few of them. I didn't know all of them. well, like I say, I kind of knew all of them. His daughter was killed in the 1920s in a car accident, so never knew her, of course. I knew Howard and Jack, who go on these trips. Howard went on some. Jack was much more of an indoors boy. He didn't enjoy them. I think he only went on a few. Carl was the star of the show in almost all the journals. Carl went to World War I. He volunteered in the ambulance corps at first, and then was later packing parachutes and things like that. But World War I was a rough war on everyone. He was a very interesting boy, but I don't think he was as solidly put together as some. He came back with shell shock and was never okay. So I met him, but could never have talked with him about the journals or anything. The other sons I did know, they outlived my dad by just a few years, so I wasn't old enough to ask the good questions yet.
I'm interested about the camera gear and did he process film all the
Sometimes he did. He carried a Graflex, large format, the big wooden camera with the hood over the head. Very similar to what Ober carried, I think, on his trips. He sometimes processed, like for instance on the Chippewa and the St. Croix, they could get to a train station, he'd ship the plates back to Milwaukee, especially the glass plate years. He went to film negatives. I think most of Renier might have been film negatives, but they were still the large format in a frame, still 4x5 negatives. And he did all of his processing once he was back. But on the trip, sometimes he shipped them back to Milwaukee, and they were kept there for his arrival.
I've read some other stuff about photographers that were out in the bush and they did processing. They wait till the moon and do it right in the camp.
There's a picture, let's see if I can quickly point to it. There's a picture in the Presque Isle Journal of my dad sitting on a log with a cloth, sort of a portable darkroom, changing plates. Not processing, but at least changing them.
Yeah.
The amount of equipment he had to carry must have been astounding. I mean, especially the glass plates. They're so heavy and fragile, but that mattered to him, so he did it. Yeah.
Did he ever talk about any of the people that lived, like from Kettle Falls to Rainier?
He talked about them in the journals, within the journals. He will mention some people, not always by name. I think, Bob, didn't you tell me that at one point you were reading a section and you realized that my dad would talk to your grandfather? Because that was where his grandfather was fishing. So when my dad talked to the fishermen. Also had a similar experience with, I'm just trying to place it now. It's Dawson, I believe. Are any of you familiar with Canoe Copia? It's a big Canoe Expo in Madison every year. It's the hugest paddle sport, whatever. It's 10,000 people come. It's this huge thing with exhibit booths and tables. And I was there signing books this spring, and a man came up to get his book signed, and then he came back the next day and he said, you know, where your dad says on page, I'm going to say 137, I don't remember exactly, that he met this Frank Savoy, said, do you realize that the people that I go, whenever I go into boundary waters, I go through Lake LaCroix, and the Savoy family are the outfitters. So he was running back and forth with the book to the Savoys. It turned out that it probably was their Matisse uncle. And so there are times that unknowingly, all have connections. And I hope to go to Atikokan later in the summer and hope to have some experience that maybe some of the native people will recognize the names and things. Like, Bob, you had that experience up north with Ober's journals. Taking them and having people that didn't know that pictures had been taken of their grandfather or that kind of thing. So I always hope for those connections because it's fun. It's one of the really fun parts of this.
The folding boats, were they Klemper or were they homemade?
I think it was a commercially made one. I don't think it would have been, I think Bill Maher would not have made one. He made canoe yokes, but that was about it. He wasn't that much of a do-it-yourselfer. So it would have been a commercial one, and the fold boat company was around then. Yeah. Still there. Yeah. They called it the Tub. It wasn't the most successful boat for their trips, and they traded it off here in Renier to someone at the end of I think the Rainy Lake trip. And then the next year they saw somebody out on the lake with it, and they kind of laughed that somebody else had the tug instead of them. You know, any other questions? I'd be glad to talk with you after. You want to look at a specific thing? Yes.
When you say large format, was it like 2 3/4 or 4x5?
4x5.
4x5.
I have some of the negatives. Some did not get damaged beyond hope, but to reproduce the pictures. And I have one, it's not here, but one of my favorite pictures from Dawson. Just give me a second, I'll page through. No, now I can't find it. There's this wonderful picture of two old Native American women. And it's from either the 1910 or the 1911 trip. And that picture was on my dad's library office above his desk. And I used to look at those women, that they had to be at least 80. They were blind and pretty. I think now they were probably 40. They just lived such a hard life. And people died so young then. But I grew up looking at those women, and they were, to me as a little child, they were like almost like people from outer space. I'd never seen people that, people standing in front of, just in a Native American village, and just these lines of faces and a wonderful character face. I'll find that to show you when I'm done. Any others?
Not for you, probably, but somebody can name when did John and Harry Erickson come to Renier? Did you ever knew that earlier?
There's a different owner.
Can I answer that?
When my dad came here.
Can I answer?
Yes. Go ahead.
John and Harry Erickson were here about 1905 to 1906. And in Howard's journals, he talks about coming to the Erickson Brothers store, who he had met the year before, and he came back and talked to them again. Of course, the store was right here.
But the hotel was owned by someone else.
The hotel was owned by someone else, and that's down at the Roosevelt.
Right, yeah.
Dad, was the hotel owned by Beaton?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
Beaton, yeah, because Bobby Hauska is a Beaton. I mean,
Yep.
that was his.
But it wasn't the European.
No,
Beaton had a restaurant in the
Yeah.
European.
he did. Right.
Yeah.
Beaton had
But this was down on Duluth Street, because when he comes back later on, he talks about how the hotel had changed from going to a hotel and nobody's staying there anymore. It's just a restaurant.
Right.
So it's talking about how things are changing back then already, very, very quickly.
Had a splendid supper at the Renier Hotel
Right.
after their trip.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I should call Bobby.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about what I'm doing Saturday in case people?
Sure.
And I'll have the slideshow.
Pardon?
I'll have the slideshow.
Okay. Martha's agreed to come to the museum between 10 and 12 on Saturday to answer any questions you might have, and also put on another presentation. So you're all welcome to stop in then and talk with her. And I'd like to apologize now for the rudeness of Renier with all the noise. Usually it's a little noisy, but not like this. I guess it's one of the well, I guess you could call it a thrill of doing things outside. Changing times. When your dad was here,
They had a train.
they had a train.
Took the train. Yep.
And there were 2 trains.
Yeah.
And now there are 38. So I guess we call that progress, right?
Rail grinders.
And I'll say one more thing and then I'll turn it back over to you. For all our members here, our annual meeting will be June 28th. Be at the Renier Community Building. And our speaker will be Doug Wood from Quan Island. I think you all know him. So put that on your calendars.
Gonna have a meal?
Yes, we're gonna have a meal.
How much?
You're gonna be cooking, Johnny.
Okay.
Without a contest.
Yeah, June 28th, that's on a Thursday.
It's summer.
I think I can do a slideshow on Saturday.
Okay.
Yeah, I
We'll
brought,
see how,
I can show you some different pictures, less of local interest probably, I have a more general one, but we'll show some different features in these pictures here. So I'd love to see you again. It won't be the same thing exactly.
And I'll also say Holyburn. I'll also say Mike has volunteered to take Martha on the thing tomorrow and show her some of the campsites that her dad actually stopped at and show her the Kettle Falls Hotel as it is today. Sure.
I no longer carry any of the original journals around. I just so fear something happening to them. They are going to the Wisconsin Historical Society, so they will get used there. But I have more than one copy of this, so I brought, just in case anyone's interested, his blueprint copy of their 1910, 1911 trips and where they portaged. This is in the book, but it's kind of nice to see what they worked with. So if you want to look at this, I'll put it up. Just don't spill the book, please.
Yeah, it actually looks pretty accurate.
Yeah, some of the lake names have changed. They were in a place and they read that it was something, but the local people would call it something else.
Right.
The Canadian Rangers were wonderfully helpful to them. The Canadian Rangers were just getting into this area around 1910 and 11. They were formed earlier, but as fire rangers rather than park rangers. And they gave him a wonderful handwritten list of the portages and things that they could take that was better than the route my dad had come up with. So one of the things I'm going to do this fall is there's a Canadian Rangers little alumni magazine, and I have some wonderful pictures of the Rangers and their names and all are there. So I'm going to write up a little article for them, again, in hopes it might connect with someone. This would be fun. But I'll put this on this table over here. Yep. And I'll be glad to answer any of the questions.
It's interesting to look at the map because you'll see some of the islands and some of the names are the same. Some are quite different and the spellings are quite different. So if you have a chance, take a quick perusal. I think you'll find it pretty interesting.
During his trips, did he interact with the natives at all? Did they trade or did they?
Yes, actually.
What kind of interaction did they have?
They visited, they bought blueberries, they paid to take pictures. People did not want pictures taken without giving them some tobacco or some little exchange of things. So they took pictures. Their pictures are not staged, which I think is another interesting feature because Curtis and so many of the other people who were going out and photographing Indians were staging a lot. And a couple of the pictures, the native people would say, just wait a second, and they went and got their beadwork on for the pictures. Because like everybody, you want to look your best for the pictures. But most of them are pretty candid and real. And they were mostly responsible about not taking pictures without permission, except for one wonderful picture.
Not here.
For the one with in the canoe.
There's a canoe there. Yeah,
The canoe one. They did not have permission for that, and the women really frowned at them if they did it.
One thing he asked about, he talked about paying. Those couple pictures there, he paid $3 for unlimited photographic rights.
$3 was what a horse and team made in the logging camp.
Yes, that was
Yeah.
a lot of money back then, but that gave him unlimited photographic rights of the village.
Mike, Mike, you had a picture. You had a picture you wanted me to... We brought a couple of different pictures along, so he's just...
Can I have one?
No. I need him.
We have the bunch.
Where did the Rangers go?
And a
Where are the
scanner.
Rangers? We'll bring it up here. Thank you.
Upside down, the Canadian.
He's Canadian American, so he puts down the Canadians all the time.
I can.
But this was when they were in camp, and this picture I love because it's a hard picture to take with that photographic equipment. In his head, he took it by flashlight. Flashlights were just coming into use at that point. I don't think they had any kind of flash thing for a camera at that point. So he set this up and managed to run around and get in it. But that's the Canadian Rangers that they met several times. The Canadian Rangers got upset that they were in there without some kind of permit they needed or were carrying but they worked it out. So, another one did you have, Mike?
Well, I think this is the presqu'île. This is how they portage
Come up here.
in the presqu'île. They had to rope it down.
1,500 pounds.
Yeah, you can see all their gear up on the.
This is them portaging on the Presque Isle River in Michigan.
There's all their
They
gear
are
up here.
they are in the river, they are in the waterfalls, portaging down with not Kevlar lightweight canoes, not 30-pound canoes.
Tough.
All their equipment and wooden crates and things, because that's what they traveled with. I found one picture of the camp. They always hired a logging camp cook that was off duty to travel with them. Summer idle, logging camp cook. And one of using one of these boxes with the Milwaukee Drug Company label on it, so, or the dad's company. But yeah, tough going. Amazing thing is one of them got bruised badly, but no one got terribly hurt on that trip. It was just a crazy trip. But there was no way out other than to keep going once they were into it. So it was more than a fine canoeing trip as promised. People didn't know. Anything else, Mike? No, nothing? Yeah. There it is. You could just set those out over there. We'll just set them out over there for people to see. They're not this specific area, so we just, the ones I showed, shall them, but you might be interested. So.
Did they carry trade goods with them?
No. I mean, they had tobacco, but, that was all they, it was a good trading thing, but no trade goods in terms of beads and things like that. It's a funny story for the Presque Isle, where they're in this, they're in this river and everything is getting soaking wet. Even the wooden frames that hold the film negatives were just falling apart. And all the men had their tobacco, and they all had their favorite tobacco. And they got so desperate at the end because each one of them had a soggy batch of tobacco. So they pulled it together and put it in a cloth and held it over the fire to dry it together. So in the same way that they dried their wet woolen blankets was by somebody on each corner holding them over the fire. So, okay. And, Mike's putting those pictures up. My dad is on the right, the Canadian Rangers, the cook working on the Milwaukee Drug box. That's Carl on the left in the beadwork and the Duluth pack. What do you got? Who's that? Oh, okay. Okay.
Somebody made the observation. There's the similarity there.
He's my dad. No denying it. Yep. Well, that I didn't buy these on purpose, but that's what someone pointed that out to me. I just bought them because I thought they were a fashion statement. But my dad's.
Like Teddy Roosevelt.
Me and Teddy Roosevelt, right? Yeah, I'm one of the Rough Riders. I mean, I do go out and do things, but not quite like they did on the Presque Isle. I'll have a sip of it. Thank you, Mike. So please come up and talk. I'd love to talk with you more. If you buy a book, I'll sign a book. Where did the bookmarks go, Mike?
They're in my pocket.
He's got bookmarks to give out to anyone that wants a bookmark. So thank you
On the
very much.
Wisconsin River, did he mention Eau Claire?
What about a book we need?
He did mention it. Yeah.
What was Eau Claire like back then?
It didn't say much about it, it was there. He talked, what he talked about on Wisconsin was how many dams there were, because anybody that wanted to put up a dam for any reason could, and they got tired of the damn dams. That's what he talks about more than anything. And that was before that was regulated.
Too many dam portages?
Yeah, sometimes they were lucky. A settler would live nearby and they did portages with the horse and wagon. That was easy, but most of them, lots of long portages, logs jammed up, they couldn't get near the dam, that's a lot of what they talk about.
Everybody wanted water all summer long.
Yeah,
They
exactly.
built the dam.
Yeah, there's the portage by horse and team. Not every day, not how everybody does it now. Thank you again. Be glad to visit more.
Did you just take one out of here? I got here first.
Johnny, act your age, would you?
Okay, sometime. Maybe when I'm 100, I might.
That's right. That's right.
Thank you.
It's kind of Haitian. Well, I would have, but I just don't want to.
That's right. You probably, Johnny, you probably sat through a book. You probably sat through a book. Probably sat through a book. I'm showing her.
I haven't done it yet. It's pretty good water.